Marcus Thompson stepped out of the black taxi onto the busy London street, with his chest puffed out like a peacock showing off its feathers. He was a big man from Texas who thought he knew everything about everything. His loud voice could be heard 3 blocks away as he complained about the taxi fare being too expensive compared to back home in Dallas. His wife Sarah walked behind him looking embarrassed as always when Marcus started his show-off routine. Their 2 teenage kids rolled their eyes and pretended they did not know him. This was supposed to be their dream family vacation to London, but Marcus was already turning it into his personal stage performance. The moment Marcus saw Buckingham Palace rising up in front of him like a giant golden cake, he started talking even louder. Tourists from all over the world were taking pictures and enjoying the beautiful sight, but Marcus had other plans. He wanted to be the center of attention as usual. Marcus pulled out his expensive camera and started taking selfies while making jokes about the British royal family. He said things like how Americans fought a war to get away from kings and queens, and how silly it was that people still bowed to them in modern times. Other American tourists nearby started laughing at his comments, which only made Marcus talk even more. Then Marcus noticed the royal guards standing perfectly still in their bright red uniforms and tall black fuzzy hats. These guards looked like toy soldiers from a Christmas display, but Marcus saw them as his next target for entertainment. He had no idea these men were real soldiers with years of serious military training. Marcus walked closer to the palace gates where several guards were standing at attention. Their rifles were held perfectly straight, and their eyes looked forward without moving even a tiny bit. Marcus thought this was the funniest thing he had ever seen. He started making jokes about how the guards looked like robots or statues in a museum. Sarah tugged on Marcus' arm and whispered for him to please stop making a scene, but Marcus was having too much fun. He told his wife to relax and said he was just having some harmless fun with the local attractions. The word attractions made it clear that Marcus saw these guards as entertainment instead of real people doing an important job. More and more tourists started gathering around Marcus as his voice got louder and his jokes got more insulting. He started walking back and forth in front of the guards, copying their stiff marching style, while making exaggerated facial expressions. Some tourists laughed while others looked uncomfortable with his behavior. Marcus began making comments about how these guards were probably just actors hired to look pretty for the tourists. He said they probably had never held a real gun in their lives and were just wearing costumes like people at Halloween. His teenage son, Jake, tried to pull his father away, but Marcus pushed him off and told him to stop being so serious all the time. The situation got worse when Marcus started taking close-up pictures of the guards' faces while making funny poses next to them. He pretended to pick their noses and made silly faces while his camera flashed. Other tourists started taking pictures of Marcus making fun of the guards, which encouraged him to act even more ridiculous. Sarah felt sick to her stomach watching her husband embarrass their entire family in front of hundreds of people. She knew Marcus loved being the center of attention, but this was going too far even for him. The guards never moved or reacted, which made Marcus think he was winning some kind of game. Marcus had no idea that his behavior was being watched very carefully by people who took the protection of the royal family very seriously. He also did not know that the guard he was focusing most of his attention on had skills that would shock him to his core. Marcus spotted one particular guard standing near the main palace gates and decided this man would be his special target for the day. The guard was tall and strong-looking with sharp blue eyes that stared straight ahead without blinking. His name was James Mitchell, but Marcus did not know this or care to find out. To Marcus, this guard was just another tourist attraction to make fun of. James stood perfectly still like a statue carved from stone. His red uniform was spotless, and his black hat sat perfectly on his head. His rifle was held at exactly the right angle, and his boots were polished so bright they reflected the London sunlight. Everything about James showed years of training and discipline, but Marcus saw none of this. Marcus walked right up to James and started waving his hands in front of the guard's face, trying to make him blink or move. When James did not react at all, Marcus thought this was even funnier. He started making faces and silly noises, like a child trying to get attention from a busy parent. The crowd of tourists grew bigger as Marcus' performance got more dramatic. People were pulling out their phones to record the crazy American making a fool of himself in front of the palace. Marcus loved having all these people watching him and taking videos that would probably end up on social media around the world. Marcus began talking directly to James, as if the guard could hear him, but was choosing to ignore him. He said things like how the guard must be bored standing there all day doing nothing important. Marcus asked James if he ever got tired of being a living mannequin for tourists to take pictures with. Then Marcus started making comments about how James probably could not protect a pet hamster, let alone the royal family. He said the guard looked strong, but was probably just for show like everything else about the British monarchy. Marcus laughed at his own jokes and looked around to make sure everyone was still watching his performance. Sarah tried one more time to get her husband to stop his embarrassing behavior. She grabbed his arm and whispered that people were staring and taking pictures of him acting like a fool. Marcus shook her off and told her loudly that these people needed to see what a real American was like compared to these fake British soldiers. Marcus pulled out his phone and started taking selfies with James in the background. He made thumbs-up signs and peace signs, while James remained completely motionless. Marcus even tried to put his arm around James' shoulders, but stopped when he realized that might get him in trouble with the police officers nearby. The jokes got meaner as Marcus started comparing British soldiers to American ones. He said American military was the strongest in the world, while British soldiers were just pretty boys in fancy uniforms. Marcus bragged about how his grandfather fought in World War II and helped save Britain from the Germans. James continued to stare straight ahead, but something very small changed in his expression. His jaw muscles tightened just a tiny bit, and his breathing became more controlled. These were signs that someone with military training might notice, but Marcus was too busy showing off to pay attention to such small details. Other tourists started feeling uncomfortable with Marcus' behavior. Some walked away shaking their heads, while others whispered to each other about the rude American. A few British tourists looked angry but did not want to cause a scene themselves. Marcus was having too much fun to notice that his audience was getting smaller and less friendly. He thought everyone loved his show, and that he was the star of the day at Buckingham Palace. Marcus decided to take his performance to the next level because he was getting bored with just making faces at James. He pulled out his phone and started recording himself while making even more insulting comments about the guard. Marcus held the phone close to his face and spoke like he was making a travel video for his friends back home in Texas. He pointed the camera at James and said this was what British soldiers looked like when they were pretending to be tough. Marcus made shooting gestures with his fingers like a little kid playing cowboys and Indians. He pretended to aim at invisible targets while saying James probably could not hit the side of a barn, even if someone painted a giant bull's eye on it. The crowd around Marcus was getting more uncomfortable by the minute. Parents started pulling their children away from the scene because Marcus was acting more and more inappropriate. Some tourists shook their heads in disgust and walked away muttering about ugly Americans, giving their country a bad reputation abroad. Marcus did not care about the disapproving looks he was getting from other people. He was too caught up in his own show to notice that most people thought he was being rude and disrespectful. His teenage daughter Emma looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground from embarrassment. Then Marcus started making jokes about British military failures throughout history. He said British soldiers always needed Americans to come save them in wars. Marcus bragged about how American soldiers were real warriors who fought real battles, while these British guards were just tourist attractions who had never seen real combat. Sarah grabbed her husband's arm harder this time and begged him to please stop before he got them all in serious trouble. She could see police officers starting to pay attention to the disturbance Marcus was causing. But Marcus was drunk on all the attention he was getting and pushed his wife's hand away. Marcus began marching around in front of James, making exaggerated military movements. He saluted in a mocking way and pretended to march like he thought British soldiers did. Marcus made his voice sound fancy and British, while saying silly things like cheerio and pip-pip, as if all British people talked like characters in old movies. Jake tried to pull his father away from the guard, but Marcus told his son to stop being such a baby. Marcus said this was educational and that his family should learn about the differences between real American strength and British weakness. His words were getting louder and attracting even more unwanted attention. James remained perfectly still through all of Marcus' insults and mockery. But people who knew how to read military body language would have noticed that James was controlling his breathing very carefully. His hands gripped his rifle just a little bit tighter, and the muscles in his neck showed he was working hard to stay calm. Marcus made his biggest mistake when he started talking about how guards like James were probably cowards who chose easy jobs because they were too scared to fight real battles. He said American soldiers went to dangerous places, while British soldiers stayed home playing dress-up for tourists. Other British tourists in the crowd started looking angry at Marcus' words. Some of them had family members who served in the military and knew that Marcus was completely wrong about British soldiers. But they stayed quiet because they did not want to cause an international incident with a rude American tourist. Marcus was completely unaware that he had just insulted some of the bravest soldiers in the world. He thought he was winning some kind of game against James and the British people watching him. Marcus had no idea how badly he was about to lose. While Marcus continued his embarrassing show, something important was happening that he completely missed. James Mitchell was sending and receiving very small signals that only trained military people would understand. His breathing pattern changed in a way that told other guards he was staying in control, but the situation was getting serious. Another guard standing 20 feet away gave James a tiny hand signal by moving just one finger on his rifle. This signal meant that backup was ready if needed, and that someone should call their supervisor. These guards had ways of communicating without moving their mouths or turning their heads. A police officer who had been watching the crowd started walking slowly toward Marcus and his family. The officer was not rushing because he could see that James was handling the situation professionally. But the officer wanted to be close enough to step in if Marcus crossed the line from being rude to actually breaking the law. Marcus was too busy performing for his phone camera to notice any of these warning signs. He kept making his silly military impressions and insulting comments about British soldiers. Marcus thought he was the star of his own comedy show and that everyone was enjoying his performance. Sarah noticed the police officer walking their way and felt her heart start beating faster. She tried again to get her husband to stop his behavior, but Marcus just laughed at her worries. He told Sarah that he was not doing anything illegal and that these British people needed to learn how to take a joke. The crowd around Marcus had changed completely from when he started his performance. Most of the tourists who had been laughing at his early jokes had walked away. The people still watching were mostly doing so because they could not believe someone could be so rude and disrespectful. Marcus made more finger guns and pretended to shoot at imaginary targets while making sound effects with his mouth. He said things like bang bang and pow pow like a child playing with toy guns. Then he pointed at James and said this guard would probably faint if he ever heard a real gun go off. James' jaw muscles became even tighter, but he continued to stare straight ahead. Years of military training had taught him how to control his emotions even when people were trying to make him angry. But Marcus kept pushing and pushing with his insults and jokes. Emma and Jake stood far enough away from their father that people might not realize they were related to him. Both teenagers were old enough to understand that their father was making a complete fool of himself and embarrassing their entire family. They wished they could just disappear or pretend they were with different parents. The police officer stopped about 10 feet away from Marcus and crossed his arms while watching the situation carefully. The officer was hoping Marcus would get bored and move on without needing to be told to stop. But Marcus was having too much fun to quit on his own. Marcus started making even more offensive comments about how British soldiers were all show and no action. He said they probably spent more time practicing how to stand still than learning how to fight real enemies. Marcus compared them to actors in a play who were just pretending to be tough. Then Marcus made a comment that showed just how little he understood about the men he was mocking. He said these guards had probably never been in a real battle or fired their guns at actual enemies. Marcus laughed and said they were like toy soldiers that came to life just to entertain tourists. If Marcus had known anything about the British military, he would have known that many Royal Guards were combat veterans who had served in some of the most dangerous places in the world. But Marcus was too ignorant and arrogant to learn anything before opening his big mouth. James continued to show perfect military discipline, even though Marcus was insulting everything he had dedicated his life to serving. The other guards nearby also stayed perfectly still and professional, even though they were probably feeling angry about the disrespect being shown to their unit and their country. Marcus made his final and biggest mistake when he said that all Royal Guards were cowards who hid behind fancy uniforms because they were too scared to fight in real wars. He said they chose easy jobs protecting old buildings instead of going to dangerous places where real soldiers proved their courage and skill. At that exact moment, something happened that Marcus did not expect. James Mitchell's shift was ending, and it was time for him to step down from his post. Marcus thought this meant he had won some kind of victory over the guard by making him give up and walk away from his position. But James did not walk away like Marcus expected. Instead, he stepped down from his post and turned to face Marcus directly for the first time. Marcus was so surprised to see the guard actually move and look at him that he stopped talking for a few seconds. James was tall and looked very strong up close. His blue eyes were calm, but there was something in them that made smart people want to be careful around him. His voice was quiet and controlled with a slight accent from northern England. He spoke like someone who was used to being listened to and obeyed. James asked Marcus in a polite but firm voice if he would like to back up all his claims about marksmanship and military skill. The way James asked the question made it sound more like a challenge than a friendly conversation. Marcus felt a little nervous for the first time, but his pride would not let him back down. Marcus laughed nervously and said he would be happy to show these fake British soldiers what real American shooting skills looked like. He bragged about all the hunting trips he had taken and how he had been shooting guns since he was 12 years old back in Texas. James nodded slowly and suggested they visit a shooting range where Marcus could demonstrate his superior American abilities with firearms. The way James said it made it clear this was not really a suggestion but more like an order. Marcus felt like he had to agree or look like a coward in front of all the people watching. Sarah grabbed her husband's arm and whispered that they should just apologize and walk away before things got worse. She could tell that something was different about this guard and that Marcus was getting into more trouble than he realized. But Marcus was too proud to listen to his wife's wisdom. Marcus told James he would be glad to meet him at any shooting range and show him how real men handled guns. Marcus said it would be educational for the British Guard to see what American military training produced compared to British toy soldiers. His words sounded braver than he actually felt inside. James gave Marcus the address of a private shooting range that was used by military and police personnel. He said he would meet Marcus there in 1 hour after he changed out of his ceremonial uniform. James spoke like this was already decided and not something Marcus could change his mind about. The crowd that had been watching Marcus' performance started to break up as people realized something serious was about to happen. Some tourists looked excited to see what would come next, while others seemed worried that Marcus had gotten himself into real trouble with the wrong person. Marcus tried to act confident as he wrote down the address James gave him, but his hands were shaking slightly. For the first time since arriving in London, Marcus was starting to wonder if he had made a mistake. But his pride and arrogance would not let him admit he was wrong or scared. Jake and Emma looked at their father with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. They could tell their dad had just challenged someone who might be much more dangerous than he appeared. Sarah felt sick to her stomach, knowing that her husband's stubbornness was about to cause serious problems for their whole family. James walked away without another word, leaving Marcus standing there trying to look confident in front of the remaining tourists. Marcus told everyone loudly that this would be fun and that the British Guard had no idea what he was getting himself into by challenging a real American. Marcus arrived at the shooting range, still talking big, and trying to convince himself that he would easily beat the British Guard in any shooting competition. The range was different from the ones Marcus had used back in Texas. This place looked more serious and professional, with thick concrete walls and high-tech equipment everywhere. When Marcus walked through the front door, he noticed that most of the people using the range looked like military or police personnel. These were not weekend hunters like Marcus was used to seeing at ranges back home. These people moved and talked like they used guns as part of their jobs, not just for fun. James arrived 15 minutes later wearing casual clothes instead of his Red Guard uniform. Without the fancy hat and ceremonial outfit, James looked even more intimidating. He was clearly in excellent physical shape and moved with the confident way that came from years of serious training. Marcus was still bragging to anyone who would listen about his hunting experience and how he had been shooting since he was a young boy. He told stories about deer hunting trips and how good his aim was with different types of rifles. But his voice sounded less confident than it had outside the palace. James brought along 2 other men who he introduced as colleagues from work. Marcus did not realize these men were also former Special Forces soldiers who had served with James in some of the most dangerous places in the world. To Marcus, they just looked like regular British guys who wanted to watch the shooting competition. The range master was a big burly man with military tattoos covering both arms. He looked at Marcus with the kind of expression that said he had seen lots of loudmouth civilians who thought they were better shooters than they really were. The range master set up targets at different distances, starting with 100 yards. Marcus chose a hunting rifle that was similar to ones he had used back in Texas. He felt more confident holding a familiar type of weapon and started bragging again about all the animals he had shot with similar guns. Marcus was trying to impress James and his friends with stories of his hunting adventures. James selected a rifle and checked it over with movements that showed he had handled thousands of different weapons in his career. His hands moved over the gun with automatic precision as he tested the sight and checked the balance. Everything James did looked professional and experienced. Other people at the shooting range stopped what they were doing to watch the competition between the loud American tourist and the quiet British man. Word had spread quickly that something interesting was about to happen, and people were curious to see how it would turn out. Marcus felt nervous for the first time as he looked at all the people watching him. Back at the palace, he had been performing for tourists who did not know anything about shooting. Here he was surrounded by people who used guns professionally and would know immediately if he was not as good as he claimed to be. Sarah, Jake, and Emma stood in the observation area watching their husband and father prepare for what they hoped would just be a friendly competition. Sarah prayed that Marcus would lose quickly and quietly so they could apologize and go back to their hotel without any more embarrassment. The range master explained the rules of the competition. They would start with close targets and work their way back to longer distances. Each shooter would get the same number of bullets and the same amount of time. The person with the most accurate shots at each distance would win that round. James listened to the rules without saying anything while Marcus kept making comments about how this would be easy for someone with his experience. Marcus was still trying to act confident, but everyone could see that he was more nervous than he wanted to admit. The atmosphere in the shooting range became tense as both men prepared for the first round of shooting. Marcus had no idea that he was about to face one of the most skilled marksmen in the British military. James had skills that Marcus could not even imagine and experience that would shock the arrogant American tourist to his core. Marcus stepped up to the shooting line, first feeling confident with the familiar weight of the hunting rifle in his hands. He took his time aiming at the targets that were set up 100 yards away. Marcus had shot at this distance many times during deer hunting season back in Texas and felt sure he would do well. Marcus fired his first 5 shots with careful aim. When they checked the targets, he had hit 4 out of 5 shots, with 3 of them close to the center ring. Marcus felt pleased with his performance and turned to smile at the people watching. He made comments about how that was just his warm-up round. Then it was James' turn to shoot. James stepped up to the line and took his shooting stance with movements that looked automatic and perfect. His breathing was controlled and his body position showed years of professional training. James did not seem nervous or excited like Marcus had been. James fired 5 shots in rapid sequence, much faster than Marcus had shot. The shots came so quickly that some people thought James was just rushing and probably missing the targets, but when they checked the results, everyone in the range became very quiet. All 5 of James' bullets had hit the exact center of their targets, not just close to the center but dead center with precision that looked almost impossible. The holes in the targets were so close together they almost looked like one big hole. Marcus stared at the targets in shock. Marcus tried to convince himself that James had just gotten lucky with that first round. He said the 100-yard distance was too easy and that the real test would come when they moved to longer ranges. Marcus was still talking big, but his voice did not sound as confident as before. They moved the targets back to 200 yards, which was getting close to the limit of Marcus' experience. He had shot at this distance a few times, but not very often. Marcus took even longer to aim this time, and his hands were starting to shake slightly from nervousness. Marcus managed to hit 3 out of 5 targets at 200 yards, but none of his shots were very close to the center. One bullet completely missed the target and hit the dirt behind it. Marcus made excuses about the wind and said the rifle sights needed adjustment. James stepped up for his turn at 200 yards and again fired quickly and smoothly. His shooting looked effortless, like he was doing something he had done thousands of times before. When they checked the targets, James had again hit perfect center shots on all 5 targets. The people watching the competition began whispering to each other about James' incredible shooting skills. Some of the other shooters at the range had stopped their own practice to watch what was happening. Marcus was starting to realize he was in serious trouble. At 300 yards, Marcus was completely out of his comfort zone. This was much farther than he had ever tried to shoot during his hunting trips. Marcus took a long time trying to aim but could barely see the targets clearly. His first shot missed completely, and his confidence crumbled. Marcus fired his remaining 4 shots, but only managed to hit the target twice, and both hits were far from the center ring. He was sweating now and making more excuses about the equipment and the lighting conditions. Marcus looked around hoping someone would suggest they stop the competition. James approached the 300-yard line with the same calm confidence he had shown at every distance. He fired his 5 shots with mechanical precision that seemed almost inhuman. Every bullet hit exactly where James intended it to go with accuracy that amazed everyone watching. By now, Marcus had stopped bragging and making excuses. He stood quietly watching James shoot with a growing understanding that he was facing someone whose skills were far beyond anything he had ever seen. Marcus finally realized he had challenged the wrong person. The competition continued to longer distances where Marcus could barely hit the targets at all, while James continued to place every shot exactly where he aimed. Marcus' face grew pale as he understood the magnitude of his mistake and how badly he had underestimated the quiet British Guard. Other people at the range were taking pictures and videos of James' incredible shooting demonstration. Some were calling friends to come see what was happening. Marcus went from being the center of attention to being completely ignored as everyone focused on James' amazing skills. As Marcus struggled with the final round of shooting at 400 yards, he could barely see the targets clearly, let alone hit them accurately. His hands were shaking so badly he could hardly hold the rifle steady. Marcus had given up trying to make excuses and was just hoping the embarrassing competition would end soon. One of James' colleagues casually walked over to where Marcus' family was standing and started making conversation. The man mentioned that James held several military marksmanship records and had won shooting competitions against some of the best snipers in the world. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized how much trouble her husband was in. Marcus stopped in the middle of aiming his rifle and turned around to stare at the man who had just spoken. Marcus asked what kind of military records they were talking about. His voice was quiet now instead of the loud bragging tone he had used all day. James finished his final shots at 400 yards with the same perfect accuracy he had shown at every other distance. Then he walked over to where Marcus was standing and calmly explained that he had served 12 years in the Special Air Service before joining the Royal Guard. James spoke about his military service like he was discussing the weather. Marcus' face went completely white when he heard the words Special Air Service. Even someone as ignorant as Marcus knew that the SAS was one of the most elite military units in the world. These were the soldiers who did the most dangerous missions that regular army units could not handle. James mentioned almost casually that he had completed 6 tours of duty in Afghanistan and 2 tours in Iraq. He explained that in those places precision shooting often meant the difference between his team members coming home alive or being sent home in coffins. James' voice stayed calm, but his words hit Marcus like physical blows. One of James' colleagues pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a photograph of James receiving a medal for distinguished service. In the picture, James was standing next to high-ranking military officials and wearing a dress uniform covered with ribbons and decorations that showed his years of brave service. Marcus' hands began shaking so badly he had to put down his rifle. He stared at the photograph and then looked at James with a new understanding of who he had been insulting and challenging. Marcus finally realized he had been making fun of a genuine war hero. James explained that many of the Royal Guards were former Special Forces soldiers who had chosen to serve their country in a different way after completing their combat tours. He said the ceremonial role required the same discipline and dedication as active combat operations, just applied in a different setting. Marcus learned that the guards he had been mocking as toy soldiers were actually some of the most highly trained and experienced military personnel in the British Armed Forces. Many of them had risked their lives in combat zones around the world before taking their positions protecting the royal family. The range master came over and told Marcus that James was famous at their facility for his incredible shooting skills. He said James often came to the range to help train police snipers and military marksmen. The range master showed Marcus a board on the wall with James' name at the top of several shooting record lists. Sarah walked over to her husband and saw that Marcus was completely shaken by what he had learned. For the first time in years, she saw her husband looking truly humble and ashamed instead of arrogant and boastful. Marcus seemed to have aged 10 years in the past few minutes. Jake and Emma watched their father struggle to process the reality of what he had done. Both teenagers felt embarrassed by their father's behavior, but also felt a little sorry for him, as they watched him realize how wrong he had been about everything. Marcus tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. He looked at James and then at the other soldiers who had been watching the competition. Marcus finally understood that he had insulted some of the bravest and most skilled people he would ever meet in his lifetime. The other people at the shooting range were looking at Marcus with expressions that ranged from pity to disgust. Everyone could see that the loud American tourist had learned a hard lesson about judging people by their appearances and making assumptions about things he knew nothing about. Marcus stood there holding his rifle and trying to figure out how to apologize for behavior that seemed unforgivable. He had spent the entire day insulting heroes and making a fool of himself in front of people who deserved his respect and gratitude instead of his mockery and arrogance. James completed his final shots with the same calm precision he had shown throughout the entire competition. He set down his rifle and turned to face Marcus, who was now standing quietly with his head hanging down in shame. The loud, arrogant tourist from earlier in the day was gone and replaced by a man who finally understood his mistakes. Instead of gloating about his victory or lecturing Marcus about his behavior, James simply began to explain some facts that Marcus should have known before opening his mouth. James spoke in the same quiet, controlled voice he had used all day, without any anger or meanness in his tone. James told Marcus that many people did not understand the reality behind the ceremony of the Royal Guards. He explained that the guards were not actors or tourist attractions, but real soldiers who had earned their positions through years of dedicated service to their country. The ceremonial duties were just as important as combat roles. James said that standing guard required the same mental discipline and physical endurance that was needed in combat situations. The guards had to stay alert and ready to respond to any threat while maintaining perfect military bearing for hours at a time. It was not an easy job for weak or untrained people. Marcus listened to every word James said without interrupting or trying to make excuses. For the first time all day, Marcus was learning instead of talking. He was beginning to understand how ignorant and disrespectful his behavior had been throughout the entire day at Buckingham Palace. James' colleagues gathered around and began sharing some of their own military experiences. They talked about serving in dangerous places around the world and how they had chosen to continue serving their country in different ways after their combat tours ended. These men were proud of their service, both past and present. Marcus finally found his voice and began apologizing profusely for his behavior and his ignorant comments. His apologies came out in a rush of words as he tried to express how sorry he was for insulting James and the other guards. Marcus' voice was shaking as he spoke. James accepted Marcus' apology graciously and said that many tourists did not understand what they were seeing when they visited the palace. He said there were no hard feelings and that Marcus had learned an important lesson about not judging people by their appearances or making assumptions about things he did not understand. Marcus asked James if there was anything he could do to make up for his terrible behavior. James smiled slightly and said that Marcus could start by treating all service members with respect and maybe learning something about the places he visited before making judgments about the people who lived there. Sarah came over and also apologized to James for her husband's behavior. She thanked James for being patient and for teaching Marcus an important lesson without being cruel about it. Sarah said she was proud of how James had handled the situation with such dignity and professionalism. Jake and Emma also apologized to James and said they were embarrassed by their father's behavior. James told the teenagers that they were not responsible for their father's actions and that they seemed like good kids who understood right from wrong better than some adults did. The other people at the shooting range began to leave as the competition ended. Some of them nodded respectfully to James as they passed by, while others just shook their heads at Marcus. Everyone had witnessed a powerful lesson about humility and respect. Marcus gathered his family and prepared to leave the shooting range. He was a completely different person than the man who had arrived in London that morning. The arrogant tourist was gone and replaced by someone who had learned that real strength comes from humility and respect for others. As they walked out of the shooting range, Marcus turned back to thank James one more time. James nodded and reminded Marcus that there were heroes and skilled people everywhere in the world if you took the time to look for them instead of judging them by their appearance. Marcus left London the next day with a new understanding of the world and a deep respect for the men and women who served their countries with honor and dignity. He never forgot the lesson he learned from James Mitchell and the other royal guards, who had shown him what real strength and character looked like. The loud, arrogant American tourist was gone forever, replaced by a man who had learned that true warriors do not need to prove themselves to ignorant people who do not understand the meaning of service and sacrifice.